Thornridge Gulch was a forgotten place, deep in the mountains of Mount Pines National Park. Once a booming gold mining town in the mid-1800s, it had been abandoned when the gold ran dry. Time had swallowed it, and now it was nothing more than a decaying collection of cabins overgrown with trees and vines. Few knew about it, and those who did never spoke of it openly. The park rangers had their own stories about Thornridge. It was said that anyone who ventured into the old town never came back. Hikers, campers, and adventurers had all vanished there, leaving behind no trace but the sound of their screams carried on the wind. Whenever rangers went to investigate, they found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle, but always returned with a feeling of dread, as if something unseen had been watching them. Ranger Andrew Drew Carter had heard the stories from his colleagues, especially the older rangers. Joe Henderson, a veteran of the park, had warned him in no uncertain terms. "Stay away from Thornridge," Joe had said one night by the fire. "You go in there, you don't come out. The place isn't just abandoned, it's cursed. I've seen rangers go looking for answers, and all they find are nightmares." Drew wasn't superstitious. He'd always figured the tales of Thornridge were just ghost stories, meant to scare the rookies. But when a hiker named Tyler Matthews went missing near the old trail that led toward the town, Drew's curiosity got the better of him. He and two other rangers were sent to search the area. They found Matthews's campsite near a stream, his gear untouched. But of him there was no sign. And then Drew saw the symbols. Strange, dark marks scrawled across the canvas of the tent, like runes, written in what looked like dried blood. A chill ran down his spine. "We need to get out of here," one of the other rangers said. They returned to base, but that night, Drew had his first nightmare. In the dream, he was walking through Thornridge. The town was in ruins, its buildings sagging and broken, the windows dark and hollow. The symbols he'd seen at the campsite were everywhere, painted on doors, etched into walls, and they were bleeding. Thick streams of blood dripped from the symbols, pooling in the dirt streets. The wind howled, carrying with it a scream, loud, raw, and full of terror. Drew tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The air grew cold, and he felt something closing in on him, something dark and malevolent. From the doorway of one of the cabins, a figure appeared, barely more than a shadow, its eyes glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. And then it smiled, a sick, twisted grin, and reached for him with hands slick with blood. Drew woke up, drenched in sweat. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking. When he looked down, he saw a fine dusting of gold powder on his bed. He stared at it, trying to understand what he had just experienced and where this gold powder came from. The nightmares didn't stop. Each night, Drew found himself back in Thornridge, surrounded by the same screams, the same blood, the same figure with its burning eyes. Every morning, there was more gold dust on his bed. He wasn't the only one. Other rangers that ventured close to that town had begun to have similar dreams, all of them involving horrific details based on what seemed like all-too-real experiences. Despite Joe's warnings, Drew felt a pull toward Thornridge. Something was drawing him in, something dark and ancient. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know the truth. One morning before dawn, Drew packed his gear and set off toward Thornridge. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The trail was overgrown and almost impassable, but he pushed through, determined to reach the town before sunset. When he arrived, the place was even more barren than in his dreams. The buildings were barely standing, their wooden frames rotting and covered in vines. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest echoes of screams. Drew entered one of the cabins, his heart racing. The inside was worse than he'd imagined. The walls were covered in those same dark symbols, the paint wet and fresh, as though it had just been applied. In the center of the room was a small gold nugget, glimmering faintly in the fading light, calling to him like it wanted him to come closer. As he reached out to touch it, the air around him exploded with sound. Screams, horrific, blood-curdling screams, filled the room, rattling the walls and shaking the ground beneath his feet. The symbols began to glow, pulsing with a sickly red light, and in the darkness he saw them. Figures, shadowy and twisted, emerging from the walls, their eyes burning with the same unnatural light as the figure in his dream. They closed in on him, their mouths twisting into grotesque smiles, their hands dripping with blood. Drew tried to back away, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick, suffocating him. The last thing Drew heard before everything went black was his own scream, echoing through the hollow streets of Thornridge. Drew Carter never returned. His fellow rangers searched for him, but they found nothing. All that remained was a faint sprinkling of gold dust near the edge of the old town. The disappearances continued. The nightmares plagued those who ventured too close, and Thornridge claimed more victims, leaving behind nothing but screams in the wind and the mystery of a town that refused to die. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.